These are the 5 most successful dictators of all time, who have outperformed almost every democracy on Earth. The first built the fastest economic transformation in history. The second was the first leader of a country that shouldn't exist. The third was a factory worker who made the poor disappear. The fourth survived 22 assassination attempts from Stalin. And the last one is a refugee who stopped a genocide of his own people. 5 dictators successful in 5 different categories, starting with category 1, transformation speed. Most successful dictator, Chung-hee of South Korea. Yes, South Korea had a dictator, and before he came to power, South Korea looked like this, and it was comparable in GDP per capita to Ghana, both sitting around $150 in 1960. But the year after he came to power, everything changed. And today, South Korea looks like this, and their GDP per capita is $36,000. Here's what happened. Park Chung-hee staged a military coup on May 16, 1961. His first move after acquiring South Korea was to arrest the country's businessmen and charge them with illicit profiteering. Some were paraded through the streets wearing signs that read, "I am a corrupt pig." And to be honest, they kind of were. Under the previous Syngman Rhee government, they had gotten sweetheart deals on foreign aid dollars, buying government property at far below market value, and receiving preferential access to scarce foreign currency which they'd use to import goods and sell at huge markups. South Korea in the 1950s ran almost entirely on American aid, and a small group of businessmen had positioned themselves as the middlemen, skimming off that aid pipeline. Then Park Chung-hee offered them a deal. Invest in the industries I tell you to invest in, or lose everything. Needless to say, they invested. He nationalized the banks, so the state controlled all credit. Low-interest loans were funneled to hand-picked companies like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and Daewoo. They were given export targets, and if they hit them, they got more money, more tax breaks, and more protection. If they missed them, however, the money would disappear. Park held meetings at the Blue House with chaebol leaders, personally set their export targets, and gave out decorations to top performers. A few interesting outcomes followed that have with almost 100% certainty affected your life. See, Hyundai, who had zero shipbuilding experience, received government backing to build the now world's largest shipyard, Ulsan Shipyard. That meant by the 1980s, South Korea ended up as the world's second largest shipbuilder. Samsung went from processing sugar and making wool to building semiconductor chips. These companies exist and are what they are today because a military dictator picked them, funded them, and shielded them until they could compete globally. The results are staggering. GDP grew at more than 8% per year for 3 decades. Exports went from $480 million to nearly $128 billion. The success is undeniable, but this economic growth didn't come without a serious human cost too. We are, after all, talking about a dictatorship. In the sweatshops, teenage girls sewed for 14 hours a day with no ventilation, and girls were given amphetamine injections to stay awake. For 18 years, ethics were pushed aside for economic growth under Park. He even amended the constitution in 1972, giving himself unlimited terms, power to appoint a third of the legislature, and emergency decree authority to suspend any freedom he wanted. But his reign ended on October 26, 1979, when his own intelligence director shot him dead at a private dinner. Finally, democracy came in 1987, but questions that remain unanswered are whether South Korea would be where it is today without him. Now, I've mentioned in some of my videos that I'm Danish, which I wanted to confirm. So I partnered with MyHeritage to do a DNA test. A test that is currently discounted to just $19 for a limited time, making it the best deal available on the market. Here's how it works. They simply sent me a box in the mail with the kit where I had to put a cotton swab in my mouth for around a minute, put it in a vial and send it back to them. With this DNA, they are able to break down my origins across 42 different ethnicities and over 2,000 geographic regions. A few weeks later, I got the results in my email, and here it is. As expected, I am mostly Danish, but surprisingly, I have some DNA from Sweden and the Netherlands. I did know about the German DNA that I have, but then some small percentages from Eastern Europe, England, and Norway are also kind of surprising to me. There's also a DNA match tool where you can find lost relatives. relatives, as well as an ancient origins feature that lets you trace your origins back 10,000 years. So if you want to learn about your DNA and your family tree, you're in luck, because they're running a special promotion where you can get your own DNA kit for just $19, the cheapest on the market. Also, your DNA is safe. MyHeritage is fully committed to your privacy with a policy to never sell or license your genetic data. So if you're curious about your own story, click the link in the description or scan the QR code you see on screen and use my coupon code OBF19 to get your DNA kit for just $19. Alright, back to the video, and our second dictator, Kuan Yew of Singapore, is quite interesting because if we talk about sheer economic growth and building probably the best run country in the world, it's hard to argue for anyone else. And his accomplishments are even more fascinating considering he didn't want Singapore to become an independent country in the first place and didn't want to become a dictator of it either, nor did his population. I know that sounds confusing, but it's important to realize that Singapore is a relatively new country and they were given independence against their will. See, in 1965, Singapore was kicked out of the Malaysian Federation because they simply didn't want it, making Singapore the only country in modern history to gain independence against its will. They were left with no army, no natural resources, including no drinking water, no industry, and with half of their population being illiterate. This was a complete disaster, and the guy running it, Kuan Yew, literally broke down crying on national television the day independence was announced. He cried because he thought his country was going to die, and it very well should have, but it didn't. Singapore's GDP per capita in 1965, when they gained independence, was just $516. By the time Lee stepped down in 1990, it was $11,862, and today it's over $90,000. They didn't find oil or gas or minerals, they obviously didn't gain any new farmland either, so let me show you what Lee did. Lee ran Singapore the way a CEO runs an international company. He made English the working language to make the Singaporean workforce attractive to global markets. He built the Economic Development Board to attract foreign companies and build infrastructure around them. When he started, Singapore's factories made matches, fish hooks, and mosquito coils. By the late 70s, they were manufacturing electronics, petrochemicals, and precision engineering. By 2001, foreign companies accounted for 75% of all manufactured output. That's only part of the story though, because Lee made sure Singaporeans learned from these companies by mandating technology transfer. If you wanted access to Singapore's cheap, disciplined, English-speaking workforce, you had to train them. And once they were trained, Singaporean companies started doing the same work themselves. And he was ruthless about corruption. Civil servants are among the highest paid government officials on earth, because Lee understood that if you pay people enough, bribery becomes pointless. In 1986, his own Minister for National Development was caught taking bribes. The man committed suicide and left a letter to Lee expressing remorse, because he knew what Lee would do to him. In 2013, a senior director at the Anti-Corruption Bureau itself was caught stealing and sentenced to 10 years. Look, a lot of great things happened under Lee, but the uncomfortable truth is he did it all without real democracy. The People's Action Party has won every single election since 1959, and it's not because they're that popular. Opposition politicians have been sued, convicted, bankrupted, and forced to sell copies of their own books on the street to pay legal debts. The thing is, Lee was open about it. He said, quote, "Between being loved and being feared, I have always believed Machiavelli was right. He said, quote, we decide what is right, never mind what the people think." Among his admirers are Richard Nixon, who wrote that Lee was a big man on a small stage who in other times might have attained the world stature of a Churchill. Margaret Thatcher said she read and analyzed every one of his speeches. That's a hell of a compliment from two democratic leaders, and is also an admission, because Churchill operated in a democracy. Kuan Yew proved you could get the same results, maybe even better, without one. And the country he built is still standing, still growing, still ranked among the richest and least corrupt on earth. Lee reshaped Singapore's identity in a single generation, changed the language, the economy, everything. The next dictator did something else and was more successful than any other on this list in sheer numbers. Deng Xiaoping of China. Now, if Lee is the most impressive story on a small scale, Deng Xiaoping is definitely the most impressive story on any skill, as he lifted more people out of poverty than any other human in history. In 1978, 88% of the Chinese population lived in extreme poverty. The country had just come out of the Cultural Revolution, a decade where Mao destroyed the education system, persecuted anyone with expertise, and left the economy in ruins. Mao also purged Deng twice. The first time during the Cultural Revolution in 1968, where Deng was stripped of all positions, denounced as a capitalist roader, and sent to work in a tractor factory in rural Jiangxi province. His son, Deng Pufang, was thrown from a third-floor window by red guards and paralyzed for life. Deng spent 4 years working the factory floor. Then Zhou Enlai, the premier at the time, convinced Mao to bring Deng back in 1973 because the country was falling apart and they needed someone competent. So Deng came back, started fixing things, got popular, and Mao then purged him again. Then Mao died in September 1976, and this is where it gets wild. Mao's wife Jiang Qing and 3 allies, the Gang of 4, tried to seize power, but Hua Guofeng, Mao's chosen successor, had them arrested within a month. So now Hua Guofeng is running China, and he's a Mao loyalist whose entire legitimacy comes from Mao having allegedly said, "With you in charge, I'm at ease." Deng was still in political exile at this point, but the military and the old guard party members wanted him back. Hua resisted for over a year, but the pressure was just too much, so Deng was officially rehabilitated in July 1977. And then Deng did something brilliant. He didn't challenge Hua directly, he praised Mao publicly while quietly dismantling Mao's policies behind closed doors. He coined the phrase, "seek truth from facts," which sounds like harmless philosophy, but was actually a direct attack on Maoist ideology, because it meant stop doing things because Mao said so and start doing things because they work. A brilliant example of making a crucial change that would be illegal under Mao is what he did once he got news of what was happening in a tiny village called Xiaoping. Here, 18 farmers had signed a secret contract. They agreed to divide the collective farmland into family plots. Each family would meet their government quota, but anything beyond that, they would keep. This was extremely illegal and it would have gotten them killed under Mao, but the famine just 15 years earlier had killed 67 of the village's 120 residents of starvation. They were understandably desperate. And the result of this was astonishing. Grain output the next year hit 6 times the previous year. Deng eventually got word of this, and instead of punishment like Mao would have done, he recognized what worked and rolled it out nationwide. This, along with other reforms, made the groundwork for China's poverty rate to decrease from 88% in 1981 to just 0.2% in 2019. Over 800 million people lifted out of extreme poverty, accounting for 75% of all global poverty reduction during that period. But Deng was also the man who ordered the tanks into Tiananmen Square. Students had been calling for democracy and free speech. Instead, the military killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese. Deng decided that economic reform would continue, but political reform would not. The deal he offered the Chinese people was simple, yet brutal. You will get richer, but you will not get free. And by the most basic measure of human welfare, can you feed your family? Do your children have a chance? Deng improved more lives than any other single leader in recorded history. No one is even close. Now, the dictators so far have all achieved something measurable: GDP growth, poverty reduction, but there's also another kind of success that's harder to quantify, and that is being universally liked. See, most dictators are feared. Some are respected, of course, but almost none are truly liked. The world treats dictators the same way you would treat a dangerous neighbor, with polite distance and for sure no dinner invitations. But this wasn't the case for Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, because he got invited to every dinner. Well, except for maybe Stalin's, because, he did try to kill him 22 times. He did this because Tito refused to subordinate Yugoslavia to Soviet control. This made the West very interested in what was going on in Yugoslavia. Here was a communist country that wasn't a Soviet puppet. Tito used that leverage brilliantly. You see, during the Cold War, every country was essentially pressured to pick a side, align with the US and NATO, or align with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Tito didn't want either, so he co-founded the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961 alongside Nehru of India, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, and Nkrumah of Ghana. The idea was that newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America shouldn't have to be pawns in a superpower chess match. And it was massively hugely successful. At its peak, the movement had over 120 member states, more than half of the UN. For Tito, this was a masterstroke. He went from leading a mid-sized Balkan country that had just been expelled from the communist bloc to being the spokesperson for half the developing world, and suddenly his influence extended worldwide. This meant Yugoslav citizens could travel freely to the West, which was unique in the communist world. Western music and consumer goods were widely available. The success here is undeniable, but let's not forget, Tito was a dictator, and he for sure lived like one. His possessions were estimated to be worth dozens of millions of euros. His luxurious living is undeniable. I mean, Richard Burton wrote in his diary that Tito lived in incredible luxury incomparable to anything I've seen. When Saddam Hussein visited Tito's nuclear bunker in Bosnia, he was so impressed he had Tito's engineers build him a replica under Baghdad. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And when Tito died on May 4th, 1980, something happened that had never happened before and hasn't happened since. His funeral drew delegations from 128 out of 154 UN member states. No other leader of any kind has drawn that many world leaders to a single event. But within 11 years of that funeral, everything he'd held together fell apart. Yugoslavia collapsed into the bloodiest European conflict since World War II. 130,000 people dead, 2.4 million refugees. The ethnic tensions Tito had managed through authority and charisma erupted the moment his authority was gone. But now to the final dictator, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, the man who stopped a genocide. It's 1994 and Paul Kagame has just taken Rwanda with a rebel army, a country that was in as horrible a state you could possibly imagine. Nearly 1 million people had just been murdered in 100 days. Neighbors killed neighbors with machetes and farming hoes, a genocide that was rooted in ethnic divisions that Belgian colonists had manufactured decades earlier. They issued identity cards classifying everyone as either Hutu or Tutsi, and in 1994, those same cards were used at roadblocks to decide who lived and who died. Kagame, a Tutsi refugee by the way, who had grown up in a Ugandan camp since the age of 2, stopped it all. He inherited a country with a GDP that had collapsed in half and a life expectancy at just 28. His first move after gaining power was to abolish these identity cards. He removed Hutu and Tutsi from all official paperwork, erasing the ethnic hierarchy. Then he rebuilt. He actually modeled Rwanda explicitly on Singapore, the country he studied most closely. He also had zero tolerance for corruption, making Rwanda one of the least corrupt nations in Africa. He also created a one-stop government agency that could register a business in just 6 hours, making Rwanda the only low-income country in the world ranked in the top 30 for ease of doing business. All of this meant that Rwanda's economy grew 7 to 8% a year for 2 decades straight. Life expectancy went from 28 to 70. And their capital, Kigali, became the cleanest city in Africa. But his election results tell you the other side of the story. I mean, the man got 93, 95, 99% approval ratings and votes, which, you know, is interesting. Critics also get kidnapped, and Freedom House has ranked him alongside Russia and China. But look, nobody on this list started with a country that was in a worse state. I mean, the citizens of the country were literally killing each other, and nobody's results are therefore harder to argue with. And he is also the only dictator on this list that is still in power. So there you have it, 5 dictators, 5 categories. Who did it best? But that's it for this video. Remember to check out MyHeritage and their DNA kit for just $19 by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code you see on screen. Thanks for watching, subscribe down below if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one.